Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast. I'm your host, Colleen Haupt, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president.
Well, Colleen, as always, a great joy.
It's good to be with you, Father. And today we're going to be talking about how contraception leads to abortion. So let's just jump right into that. How does contraception create a pro-abortion mentality?
Sure. Well, that's the real operative word, Colleen, that you mentioned is mentality. Mm-hmm. Father Marx, HLI's founder, from the very beginning of our organization's apostolic work, this is something he highlighted so strongly, and that is so often missed today in our pro-life movement, is the connection between the mindset, which is a single mindset, really, of abortion and contraception. So when we're talking about a mentality, we're talking about a way a person approaches a particular subject, a framework, the way that someone thinks about it, the way that someone acts upon it, and moves forward in time. So when a person has a contraceptive mentality, it means that they are opposed to conception, just as basic as that, and that they are not wanting to welcome a child from a sexual encounter, which should be only within marriage, a conjugal act between a husband and wife. That's a different, subject for another day for us to talk about. But this is where this gift of welcoming life is meant to be, between a husband and a wife, always in every way open to welcoming a child, and so anything that's preventative in that manner, so it could be in any kind of act, or either by a mechanical means, it can be done by a hormonal means, like taking what people call the pill, and it can be through interruption. In other words, any method that prevents the completion of the conjugal act is a contraceptive act. And so, but it starts with a mindset. And it's so important to keep that in mind, is that as we talk about this, that it's how a person approaches this true good, that God has created between husband and wife, for the welcoming of children. And so when we have a mindset that is opposed to that child, for whatever reason, there could be legitimate circumstances in a person's journey. What I mean by legitimate here is not legitimizing contraception, but that there may be a need to postpone a pregnancy. There could be something that is happening within the marriage that needs, it could be medical, it could be a situation, but obviously choosing an act or choosing to act upon one's thought, this mindset that is opposed to the gift of human life, is never permissible. So that's why we consider contraception a intrinsic evil in itself. It is always bad, can never be chosen. So what the mentality does, Colleen, is it obviously when a contraceptive act does not fulfill its end, in other words, a conception occurs, the child was not wanted to begin with in that mentality. And in most regard, a person then follows through by choosing abortion, a means to accomplish the end that they had chosen, which is not to have a child. So it's a single mentality. And so as we've seen, as contraception and its mentality became more widely accepted, more widely practiced, what do we see? We see an increase in abortion. Why? Because as we know from all the data, from all the research, that in many cases, contraception fails. And so the very intention of preventing a pregnancy doesn't result that way. And so when there is a conception that occurs, then the said couple then decides that we're going to pursue an abortion. And so we see the data. The data is very clear, and I know that we talk about this on our website and many of our articles, and so I know that you're probably going to put some links out there for them. Yes. That way they can go and look themselves. They can read for themselves the data that's out there.
And we also have an ebook that we have on this subject that I'll link in the description as well, because that has a lot of history and a lot of the dates of how it was legalized in different countries.
And what we see, for example, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I'll just kind of lead into it. So when in our work around the world, especially in the developing nations, where contraception is now becoming more accessible, we also see the accessibility to abortion. We see the call for a legalization of abortion. Why? Again, because as the mindset of contraception and against life, an anti-life mentality begins to find root, then it naturally will then call for the fullness of that act, and that is the termination, quote, of a pregnancy, i.e. abortion.
And how would you respond to people that say that contraception would reduce abortion because it gets rid of unwanted pregnancies? With quotes, a lot of people use that argument to justify contraception, but how would you reply to that given the light of this?
Well, just think about this. We're talking then about eugenics now. We're talking about, selectively choosing, who lives and who dies, and very arbitrary, decision-making process. And as we know, again, from just data, just simply following the data, we see what happens in today's current culture and climate that is very much, for genetic research, but what that really means is selectively choosing, a child that, that let's say a child is diagnosed, let's say, with a particular abnormality, then and we also know, just to kind of pause for a second there, that sometimes it's inaccurate. Sometimes what has been determined doesn't actually come to bear. So, but in reality, if a couple goes in and the doctor says your child has A, then basically what we're doing now is we're saying, I don't want that child. And we use euphemisms to kind of cover up what we're doing. We don't want the child to suffer. We wouldn't want this, to be a difficult pregnancy. We wouldn't want the child to be born and have all these difficulties in life. So we kind of mask it, using compassion and so forth. But in reality, we're discriminating against a child. But on the genetic side, what we're talking about now is being able to determine, does this child have a predisposition toward, some type of genetic abnormality. It could be Down syndrome, for example. It could be, in some situations I've seen where I just read a case just recently in a book I've been reading on this about dwarfism. Now, I know there's a more scientific term there, which I can never pronounce, but basically it involved a couple, a husband and wife, themselves, in the sense of the terms here of little people, in the sense of dwarfism, and what they found was the child that she was now pregnant with did not carry that gene. So it would have been a child that would have grown into, I use the word here normal, but into a normal height and so forth, and none of those difficulties that we see with dwarfism, and they wanted to abort the child. So these are realities, and so what we see, just kind of returning back to a mindset. So when we look at life pretty much as a utilitarian approach, as almost kind of like a commodity, as we would do from a piece of paper that is flawed. Well, I'm not going to write a letter on that piece of paper. I'll use it for something else, or I'll discard it. But a human being is not a commodity, not a thing, and has immeasurable value in themselves. And they can never be so arbitrarily treated in this regard. And we know that life begins, sorry, I'm going to toss it back, and is that begins at fertilization, at the moment that, egg and sperm meet. This moment occurs, and this is life. And a very beautiful life, an individual life with its own genetic code, and it's male and female. It's already determined, and all this beauty is before us. And so this is something that we have to really work against, this mentality. So I think that's a real challenge. Well,
I get what you're saying about how after the child has already been conceived, but I think what I was referring more to was people say pro-lifers should support contraception because those children are never conceived in the first place, so they're not being killed later. Yeah. So how do you respond to that argument that you should use contraception so children are never conceived in the first place, so they're not killed later?
Sure. Sorry. John
I didn't
Paul,
clarify that.
No. John Paul, second really talked about this. And every potential child is a gift. So in other words, the potentiality from this conjugal act, because we also know that not every conjugal act that is open to life, actually conceives a child. So, but always must be open. Always must be welcoming to this child, this potential, this wonderful opportunity that's before husband and wife. And so every child brings with it this great potential, these great gifts, these great wonders, and even challenges, challenges to us, for a couple, that may, be dealing with a child with Down syndrome. At first it's, imagine, and I've talked to many couples, it faces difficulties, there's lots of fears, there's probably anxiousness about what will be expected of them in a lifetime, but then this beautiful child comes into their lives and changes everything in a good way, and even with the challenges, and the beauty and the wonder and the awe that this child offers, and the creativity and all the wonder. And I think what happens is the anti-life mentality feeds on that anxiousness and fear of the unknowns. Well, there's always unknowns, Colleen, in life itself. Even, for you and for me every day, there always are unknowns. And of course, in welcoming a child, there's always the unknown. Will this child be, do well in school? Will this child have, difficulties in life? Will this child, live a long life? Will this child live a short life? There's always these unknowns. And I think we're back to that mentality that, we want to be in control of everything. We want to have the ability to put our finger on it and control it and manipulate it. And but this is not life. And so life is filled with a lot of uncertainties and a lot of unknowns. But that's what makes life such worth living and such an excitement. And nothing is boring. And so the same thing with the welcoming of a child. It's all the beauty of the potential that this child is going to bring and the amount of love that this child is not only going to expect, but the love this child is going to give. And I think we really have allowed that mentality, that anti-life mentality. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot out there that speaks about, one of our staff members, I'm going to use an example, their son, and his wife were welcoming, I forget if this was their first or their second child, but the child was not going to survive, not long after birth. And so, of course, what do we hear? We hear, the doctors saying, well, we ought to terminate, abort. We need to kill this child. And, quote, we can do it. We can try again. Well, the reality is that, no, this child is going to be loved and welcomed. And this child was born, into this world. And outside the womb was loved, held, nurtured, kissed, all these wonderful things. And I think that really is something we just got to keep reminding people of, that life is a gift and life has many, many unknowns. And I think that what happens is we're trying to create a perfect utopia. And we've been down this path before in history, where people wanted to create a superior race and a superior mindset. And people need to remember that this becomes very arbitrary. Who determines what is, quote, normal? Who determines what is, a perfect, genetic race? This is a danger. And that's why the mindset is such a very bad mindset. And sadly, when the mindset becomes applied, it's applied to people and it becomes discriminatory. This is what we're really talking about.
And then historically, how has this played out where contraception leads to abortion? And how does it affect developing countries? Because I know it's a big deal there. And you mentioned that briefly, but kind of going into that a little more.
Right. So in the developing world where, children are seen, and again, it depends on which culture, but across the cultural lines, children are always seen as a great blessing and welcomed. But in the developing world, there are many challenges. We just talked about just some of these. But in the developing world, the challenge of raising a child, feeding the child, clothing, educating, becomes a real difficulty for many people in the developing world because they don't have the resources, that we may have here in Western culture. And what I mean by that is just the conveniences that you, myself, Colleen, are very, very much just accustomed to. And so, but there are challenges in the developing world. But this is, again, where we need to step back. And as part of our solidarity with our brothers and sisters around the world, it's a deeper question. How do we help our brothers and sisters in the developing world have access to the very things that you and myself readily have access? And I'm just going to use a couple of things. Just clean water, health care, good infrastructure, farming equipment, electrification, just basic things that you and I take for granted every day, which makes life more simple. And yet what I see in the developing world is such a welcoming of life, even with those challenges. And I see it all the time in my mission travels, whereas here in the West, we have a very selfish mentality, and yet we live so comfortably, so conveniently, and yet we're against life. I mean, here in the U.S., we well are below replacement level and have been now for a number of years. So we're not welcoming children. And yet I go into the developing world where these difficulties are there, and you encounter such beautiful, large families, and these children are loved. And yes, there are challenges, and yes, sometimes it is difficult to see. But this is what happens when the Western world imposes its values. It imposes its mindset on the developing world. And so contraception, becomes part in many ways of how aid is given. And we talked about this before. This is something we talked about when we discussed Pope Benedict XVI, And I think people need to go back and read, his third encyclical. And I'm not going to name it, so maybe people will go back, what's the third one? And look for it. But how he talks about, the negatively, how governments and non-governmental organizations are imposing Western values and ideologies upon the developing world. And so contraception is just that. We've had contraception for centuries and millennia in a sense of, but it's always been challenged, always not accepted, especially in Christian culture. And so to see this in the developing world being imposed, being, literally manipulating people to open themselves to contraception as if it were an answer to poverty. It's not an answer to poverty. And so why? Because we haven't changed the structures that cause poverty. We really haven't changed the infrastructure that's literally causing these challenges and difficulties. And the number of children are not the cause for this. There are challenges, yes, with larger families. Absolutely, we've talked about that. And but the reality is, what about the developing world really giving legitimate aid to the developing world, so that they have the structures they need in order to have those things that are basic to humanity, and then which makes family life much more comfortable and reasonable, and allow their families to grow and allow their countries to prosper. So this mentality, and I'm trying to connect it to, because it's connected to everything, is it leads then to an abortifacient mentality. So remember I said they're the same. But in the developing world, outside of major cities, you get into the rural community, this mindset would be very appalling, to the majority of the people. They could not imagine killing their child. They could not imagine, taking the life of their child. And so what happens is, but you see large groups come in, like International Planned Parenthood. You see Marie Stopes Federation come in, and you see all these various groups working on the ground, and they're pushing contraception. But we're going to talk a little bit about that, because obviously we know that oral contraception, hormonal contraception, also acts as an abortifacient. So we know that abortions are occurring, even though it may not be a surgical abortion, but they are occurring. We call silent abortions. And so it's important for people, one, to understand the mentality, to understand why the Western world is so set on imposing their own values upon the developing world, i.e. reproductive health, which means contraception, abortion, sterilization. When you hear that phrase, reproductive health, that's what it means. And then it brings a false value. It's not a value at all. I mean, it's wrong. It's reprehensible, and it's repulsive, to people in many parts of the world who could not imagine this, but it's there. And that's the challenge that we have as missionaries of life, and going around the world to help people to see these things and to recognize them and then provide a means forward that respects life is a challenge. Because many of these entities that are working on the ground in the developing world have much more resource, much more financial resource, personnel that's available to them, and they're able to get into many places and push their wares upon an unsuspecting, vulnerable people.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I maybe give you more. But it, as you can tell, it's very passionate to both of us. It's passionate to us here at HLI because Father Marks made it very clear that we're never going to really prevent the abortion industry from being able to take deeper root until we challenge the first issue, which is contraception.
So basically, like when people get into their heads that they can stop pregnancy and that they... Right. Just like, okay, well, this isn't, quote, the right time for it, so I'm just not going to because I'm going to use contraceptive, then they're more likely to choose abortion down the road. So it kind of creates this idea that they can control their own fertility in that way.
And also with that, Colleen, would be is it changes the marital act, which is something that we don't have time today to get into. But really, so this is why it's more than just a single, issue. It's multiple issues at work here because we're literally changing the conjugal act. We're making it into an act that it's not meant to be, and we're actually redefining
divorcing it basically from procreation.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Which is one of the ends of the of marriage, and so we're changing the act. We're falsifying the act, and so this is what contraception does. because it's contra, it's against. It doesn't want life. And again, as you said very early when, I kind of sidestepped and didn't answer your question directly, but you came back, which is good, is that the mentality is that, we want to treat it as we want to create this environment. So we use different ways of language to justify our position. So an example, again, that, we're not wanting to welcome life at this time. There can be a reason to have abstinence and to postpone a pregnancy at this time, and that thus employ abstinence in the marital relationship out of respect for whatever that situation is. But to employ an act that is contraceptive in mindset and contraceptive in act changes the act. It redefines the act, and it falsifies the act, and thus it is an evil act. And so it's never acceptable. And so this is the real challenge, and that's why within marriage, to do anything that is contrary to that good in the conjugal act is opposed to that good. And so that's why we got to tie it in. Yeah. And so, but in our world today, that, as Father Marx would say, what would it say today, as he said back then, we're in a sex-saturated culture. And so it doesn't see what we're talking about. Matter of fact, it would consider what you and myself are discussing really, just completely in the past. I mean, this is not something we talk about today. I mean, this is completely, against the culture and the narrative of our day. But again, this is truth. There's a truth about marriage. There's a truth about the good of marriage. There's a truth about the good of conjugal love. And there is the good of life itself. And anything that falsifies really is that. It falsifies. And so no matter how people attempt to justify. And so I think that's what's so important when we're in the developing world. Because marriage is a very true good, to every culture. Obviously, but in the developing world, marriage is important. The relationship between a husband and wife, fidelity, the commitment to each other is so important. And what we see is like we see in our studies here in our own country and many Western cultures, what do we see as a consequence? Paul VI in Humanae Vitae talked about this. And again, time doesn't permit us, but people can go back and read. What were those prophecies of Paul VI that he mentions in Humanae Vitae? Each one has come to pass. What do we see, with no-fault divorce? What do we see as a result of this contraception? And then we're not even talking about the medical consequences. But that's for a different moment. But maybe they can go back and read a little more from our, the animated series and, looking at this and learn a little bit more about this. But I think it's good what we're doing, Colleen, is that by keeping the dots connected, as we're talking about a subject of great importance, that does affect, the population of our world. And because, the majority of our world are married people and, and adults who are wanting and choosing to enter into relationships and sexual relationships and as sexual beings. And so this is a very important conversation, and we need to keep having it.
Well, I think a lot of people, too, think that the contraceptive issue is different than the abortion issue, and they're not. They're interrelated. So
that's correct.
I think, is it John Paul II who says they're both fruits of the same tree?
That's correct.
Or something. Yeah.
Because they flow from the same mentality. They flow from that same mindset, that's one contra. I mean, just keeping that in mind. I'm opposed to life. And as I said, there are many reasons why a couple may want to postpone, but it doesn't mean they're legitimate. It doesn't mean that I can choose an evil means to accomplish the end that I'm seeking. And so it's never permissible to do that. And so I think it's important for us to keep this conversation and keep the linkage. And if I may, even as a pro-life leader and as people, you and myself, engaged in pro-life activity and missionary work around the world, that, we are going to fight tirelessly to end the violence of abortion. And we're going to do that on every avenue and venue we can, politically, on the legislative side, on the political side, and we're going to do it in the educational side, on every other platform we can. But Father Marx made it very clear, is that we're never going to eradicate that violence until we eradicate the first violence. And that's the violence against marriage. It's the violence against the conjugal act. It's the violence against the good of the conjugal act. And I think that's very important. And so many in our pro-life movement don't even talk about contraception. It's just accepted. They would never approve of the abortifacient side. So here, what I mean by that, they would be talking about the use of a barrier method, a condom, or some other method that doesn't have an abortifacient characteristic to it. That's what let me make sure I get that very clear, because I don't want to speak ill of our brothers and sisters in the movement. I mean, I know full well they're not for abortifacients at all, but I think many people don't realize the abortifacient connection. I think there's a lot of poor education. Why? Because the narrative in our culture, controlled by the media, controlled by, sadly, even within medicine, that falsifies its own definition when life begins. And so as a result, people buy into the narrative, into the cultural narrative. So we have to challenge it and say, no, that, the oral contraception, what people would call the pill, has an abortifacient character. All right, and if we have time, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But I know that our series will get into this in great detail in many of our articles. But I'm not only our listeners. I hope our listeners can help other friends that they have understand when they say, "Oh, yeah, we're just postponing children, and we should," even though we say we shouldn't stick our nose where it doesn't belong, but we should in a respectful manner, especially among our friends that we can talk to and say, do you realize that there's an abortifacient character to this? Not again that contraception is ever permissible because it doesn't have abortifacient characteristic. No, it's never permissible. But many people don't see the connection, Colleen. And they'd be shocked to find about the abortifacient connection. Exactly. Which is what a lot of people don't realize. Right. So, yeah. Right. And I think what's good, and so I'm going to give you an example. I brought something with us to me today. So a little show and tell for a moment, okay? Yeah. And now, when you go to the National Library of Medicine, you can look up any information on any of the oral contraceptives that are out there. So, and there are hundreds of them, all right? I just picked out one for the day. So this one's, Misoprostol. So people would be familiar with this and these tablets. And so on the very first page, now this is printed off the internet. So if it were placed inside of a box or the insert, it would be seen differently. But this is the first page on the printed version, and immediately it says Misoprostol tablets should not be taken by pregnant women. But then it goes on to say it prevents implantation. So here, what we're dealing with is those three effects of taking the pill. Hormonal contraception. And so what is it? One effect is to try to prevent ovulation, all right? So to prevent the possibility of sperm and egg meeting. Second can be to create where the mucus builds up, around the cervix, thus preventing the possibility of sperm, again, encountering an ovum. It also changes sometimes the mobility of sperm, again. And those would both be contraceptive because they're keeping conception from happening. Correct. Right. But the third one's the abortifacient. Right, because it changes the endometrium lining of the uterus. So what happens there is that it prevents, so now a newly conceived human being, right, a fertilized egg that now is a human being in its very earliest stages of development, a blastocyst. And so what happens now is to prevent that newly, new life from implanting in the womb of its mother, which should be a welcoming environment, very fertile and very, very welcoming, now creates a hostile environment. And so this is what we need to recognize in this. And so this is why it's important for people to be educated. So what we do in the field is we bring a lot of this information to bear. Because one, we can look at all the various consequences, medical consequences, all the various chemical consequences, and that's important. And we have doctors in our medical who work with us in the mission field, and they can bring all that to bear, the nurses, the doctors, and so forth. But what's important is that, is to help people to understand, one, choosing an active contraception is never permissible. Two, that if you choose to take an oral contraceptive, this is part of the effect of that oral contraceptive. And so by doing so, you're opening yourself up, to even to expand the evil act of contraception into an abortifacient act. Yeah. And so it's leading directly to abortion in that sense. Exactly. And so what we see is the numbers grow up, so the numbers move. And so that's why an increase in access to contraception increases the number of abortions. And so just got to follow the data, and it's very clear So I think it's our challenge today. But if I may, Colleen, I think we just need to pull back, just constantly pull back. And that's what I love about our missionary work here, is we want to try to get back to the root issue, the fundamental issue. And we've talked about it many times, just making reference to it. And that is the good of marriage and the good of conjugal love. And to talk about that and to really support the good. And to see children, no matter what the child may bring into life, the challenges and the beauty, that that life is a gift, life is precious, life is to be welcomed, and life is to be celebrated, and that every act between husband and wife is to have that mindset, and to be open to whatever that life will bring. And to know that it will teach us how to love and how to care and how to sacrifice and how to give of ourselves in so many ways. Yeah. So I think that's why our work wants to get underneath it. We expose the issues, but that's one part of the equation. We have to come back and promote the good, promote what is good, and help people to see the good and to realize that there is. And I mean, if we look at all the harm that's been done today in our culture, because of its addiction, literally, it's just got an addictive mindset and a very selfish mindset, and this is the consequence that we see, and it leads to the eugenic mentality. We talked a little bit about it, and we see that today growing very sadly, and we're going to see a continual breakdown of families. Divorce is going to continue to grow, not become less. Matter of fact, today maybe those numbers are changing because most people don't get married. Yeah. So there's so much for us to be doing, so much work for us to be working upon, and that's why there's as long as this continues, there will always be this opportunity for you and for me and others to keep talking and to keep advancing the mission.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Father. And to our listeners, I will link the ebook and maybe some other resources in the bio. And in the meantime, please follow, subscribe, share with your friends, whether you're listening on YouTube, Rumble, or any of our audio platforms, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.